What's up, everybody? My name is Aaron, and this is the first edition of Bible Study with an Atheist. Thanks so much for checking this out. I really do appreciate it, and I hope that you do enjoy it. Now, before we do get into the meat and potatoes of this particular video, though, I do want to give a little bit of a breakdown as to what to expect from this point forward. Basically, I, an atheist, am going to be reading the Bible from the very beginning of Genesis straight through to the end of Revelations. And every single Sunday, I will be posting up a video giving you my thoughts on what I have read over the last 7 days. Some weeks, videos may be longer, more profound, they may be funny, they may be absolutely insane. Sometimes they may be quite short, depending on how much I'm able to read. So it's going to be quite an interesting journey. I don't really know what to expect, to be honest, since I haven't read the Bible before. However, I can say that based on the little bit I have read that I'll be talking about towards the second half of this video, things may get interesting. So I definitely appreciate you guys checking this out, and I hope that you do make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell notification so that way you are reminded every single Sunday when I post up, and you can get this atheist's perspective on what they've read over the last 7 days. Now, I do also want to make sure you have a good idea as to where I am coming from as I give my perspective on what I'm reading. So I'd like to give a quick little history breakdown, essentially, on my experience within religion. I was born in '86, and for the first 10 years of my life, my family and I would go to church every single Sunday. From 10:30 to noon, we could be found at our local Assembly of God church. I believed in God at that point in time in my life more than I ever have at any other point in time. However, I believed in God at that point much like I believed in Santa Claus. I believed in God because the people around me seemed to believe, and they kind of pushed me to believe as well. So, as a kid, I believed, but I believed like I believed in Santa Claus. Every fall and winter, when Sunday would roll around and we'd be at church, it'd be like 11:45, I'd start to really begin to bug my parents. Mom, Dad, when are we going to go? Is the sermon almost over? The football game is going to start. We're going to miss the kickoff. I want to go watch some football. Every single Sunday during the fall and winter. So that should give you a little idea, perspective-wise, on how my priorities were. I was a kid. I believed because I was told to, not because I understood and believed of my own free will. Now, once I hit 10 years old, my family and I, we moved from Florida to Texas, and because we didn't really have a church we were associated with, we pretty much just kind of stopped going. And from the age of about 10 to, I'd say, about 15, I just didn't think about religion. I just didn't care. It didn't matter in my daily life. I cared more about my friend's opinion of me and catching the eye of a cute girl. That's where my priorities lay. I didn't care. I didn't think about God or religion at all. Then once I hit about 15, I started getting more into science and space, reading more books on the subjects and watching more documentaries, things like that. And I became really, really fascinated with the subject of space. And then around 16 or so, my mind began to try and grapple with a theory that I'd always been taught about our universe. And that was that the universe could very well be infinite. And around 16, I started really thinking about this a lot. If the universe is infinite, then that means there is no end to it in any way, shape, or form. The universe just constantly goes on. There is no end. Well, in relation to God, where did God exist before the universe? If the universe is infinite, then where does God exist in? In what plane of existence is God? It just didn't make sense to me, and I could not wrap my head around it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I didn't understand where that was, how those two ideas could be reconcilable. I just didn't see it. And so from that point on, The idea of God and religion to me was ridiculous. Not only did I not believe, but if you believed, I saw you as a moron. It didn't matter how much intelligence you actually had. You could have been a Nobel Prize winning mathematician. I didn't care. If you went home after writing up all of your equations and theories and you read the Bible and you believed it, you, in my eyes, at 15 to 25 years old, were a moron. It didn't matter if you were a NASA engineer. If you believed that Mary had Jesus as a virgin and that some being that isn't human was the Father, you were a moron. If you believed that Noah was somehow able to build a boat that was capable of carrying 2 of every single species on this planet, you were a moron. That was that 10-year span. I was hostile towards people of religion and people who believed in religion. I was hostile. If you've ever seen the documentary Religulous, Bill Maher is a perfect example of how I was at that point in time in my life. But as I got older, I got into my mid-20s, into my late 20s, and into my 30s, I just got to the point where I just didn't care if you believed anymore. It just doesn't matter in my daily life. If you believe in God and it makes you happy, believe in God by all means. What does it matter to me? And the simple answer is it doesn't. If you want to believe that Mary was a virgin when she had Jesus, go right ahead. It doesn't impact me if you believe that. If you want to believe that Noah had an ark and was capable of putting 2 of every single animal species on there, you go right ahead and believe it because it doesn't impact me at all. So why should I care? And that's pretty much how I have lived pretty much the last decade of my life. Now, I will say there has been pushback on that by many other atheists that I've talked to about this. They'll say that they'll tell me that, I can preach that you believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe because you believing in God doesn't impact me. They'll come to me and say that it does. Because if people believe in certain religions, that's going to inevitably impact how they view politics and therefore impact the way we live our lives, our way of life. My response to that is simple. Look at the last 120 years. Go back to 1900. We were a very religious society, easy for me to say. But as the 20th century progressed and we've moved into the 21st century, religion has lost its impactfulness. It's lost its, I can't think of the word. It's lost its sway. It's lost its power. It's not as influential as it once was. And as the 1900s progressed and we moved into the 2000s, religion is losing its grasp. And as that is occurring, the society that we live in, its rate of decrease is increasing. So basically, the amount of decline that our civilization is going through is actually increasing as the grasp of religion loosens on society and on our politics. So is it really a bad thing if a little more religion finds its way into our politics and into our way of life? Even as an atheist, I look at the last 100 years, I look at that correlation of rate of increase for decline and a decrease in the influence of religion. I put those two together. Those two go hand in hand. So even as an atheist, I say that a little more impact on our daily lives and on our politics from religion may not be a bad thing. And that's kind of where I find myself at today. I also, today, do not deny the possibility that there could be God out there, that God could exist. There are so many statistical improbabilities within the universe that had to occur in order for life to flourish the way that it has on Earth, that the idea it occurred without some level of interference is actually pretty implausible. So many minor details had to line up just perfectly for life to evolve in a way that humans were possible. That the idea something didn't interfere, it is a little hard to believe. So with that in mind, if someone were to come up to me today and put a gun to my head and say, commit to a belief here and now that you must believe in the rest of your life or I will end it, I would probably have to lean towards simulation theory. I think if you look at the last 50 years of technological growth and you look at the trajectory we're on going forward for the next 50 years in terms of technology, our species is not far away from being able to create a simulation that would be similar to a simulation in regards to simulation theory. So basically, in the 70s, we had Pong. Computers took up entire rooms. Just 50 years later, we have smarter computers in our pocket than what took us to the moon in 1969. If you look at Pong in the 70s, it's just a few pixels and that's it. And that was high-end technology. That was state-of-the-art. Now, today, 50 years later, we have these massive multiplayer online games that allow thousands and thousands of people to play at the same time, anywhere in the world, in a virtual world that looks extremely realistic. Imagine where we will be at in another 50 years. Virtual reality technology is making leaps and bounds. So imagine that it's 2071. Virtual reality is taking over and we've got Sims 15 coming out. Graphics are absolutely insane. There will come a point to where you will be playing a Sims game in virtual reality through a first-person perspective. And when you take off your virtual reality goggles, the real world will feel less real than the virtual one. That is the path we are already on. And if we're on it, who's to say that another species hasn't done it before? Elon Musk goes into a much better explanation of why it's so probable. For me, I also look at a lot of those statistical improbabilities within space and the universe, and it makes sense that a simulation theory would be in place. That would cause all of those little things to happen in each little required way for life to exist, because it was put into place through a simulation theory. The interesting thing, though, about simulation theory that no one talks about is that simulation theory, if it were proven to be true, would also prove God exists. Now, what do I mean by that? How can the proof of simulation theory being fact, how can that prove that God is real? Well, simulation theory means that we are in a simulation. Simulations would have to have been created by someone or something. That, by definition, would be God. God created the heavens and the earth, created light and dark, and created all animals, mankind, and other beasts. By definition, the creator of our simulation would be God. So if simulation theory is true, God has to exist. Very, very strange. And so it's a little bit of a conundrum that I don't really believe in religion, but I do kind of believe in a lot of the tenets behind simulation theory. So, little interesting conundrum, but I think that gives you a really good up-to-date breakdown on my history within religion, where I'm at today, so that way you can know where I am coming from as I read into this Bible and bring you my thoughts on it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before getting into the real topic of discussion today is why I'm doing this. Over the past several months, I have had failure after failure after failure, and not small failures, big failures that I tried everything I could to make work, but they still failed. Still failed. everything I tried, I came to a realization they were out of my hands. No matter what I could have done differently, it would have ended up the same because it was out of my hands. Then in July and August, I had 2 family friends pass away unexpectedly, and I had to unexpectedly put my dog to sleep. That dog was my best friend. He had been through so much with me, including bringing me back from depression after a divorce. That dog meant everything to me. And one day he was fine, and 2 days later I was hugging him as he was passing over the Rainbow Bridge. Currently, today, my aunt is in the hospital with psoriasis of the liver due to medication complications. So not only have I been hit by these massive failures I've come to realize were just completely out of my hands, but I've also been hit with mortality realizations consistently for the past 2 months. All the while, I have been having these strange urges to pray. The reason why I say they're strange is because usually urges come from within. You can usually feel the chemicals releasing, you can feel your muscles tensing, and it's almost like you're being pulled towards the urge. This urge that I've been experiencing, though, the only way I know how to describe it is that it wasn't coming from within. It was coming from without, and I don't know how to explain that. But it wasn't a pull, it was a push. It was incredibly strange. But I ignored that urge to pray. I ignored it, and I ignored it, and I ignored it. And a couple of days after my dog crossed the Rainbow Bridge, my other dog, Timon, and I, we were not doing well at all. At all. Timon wasn't eating. He was barely getting up, and this is usually a really hyper dog. He's a Chihuahua mix, and I couldn't concentrate on work. So that Friday, August the 13th, I called out of work, found a hiking trail up in Flagstaff, Arizona, checked the weather, and realized, all right, there's going to be some thunderstorms later in the afternoon, but this trail is an out and back, and it's 8.1 miles. We should be good to go. We should be able to get there and get back within an hour and a half to 2 hours before the storms even roll in. So I grabbed Timon, and we make the 2.5 hour trek up to Flagstaff, Arizona. But once we're already on the trail, we find out the trail is actually 8.1 miles there and 8.1 miles back. So a trail that I thought we would have been able to take care of and hike the entire way before we had to worry about the storms was then looking like it was going to put us in the middle of the mountains with a thunderstorm rolling in. We get about a third of the way back. And off in the distance, you can start to tell the clouds are starting to roll in. There are a couple of faint little rolls of thunder. Then we get about 3/4 of the way back. There's about 2 miles left between us and the car. And the sky looks like a blanket's been pulled over it. It is dark. And the lightning is close. It's flashing through the mountains and through the woods, and within 2 seconds, that thunder is rolling through us, and it looks like the leaves are actually being shaken by the thunder. I pick Timon up, I put him in my backpack, and I start running as fast as I can. See, most people would be scared. Most people would be at least nervous in a circumstance like that. I'm not most people. I have been indirectly struck by lightning multiple times, and once you are struck once, you are more likely to be struck again than someone is likely to be struck a first time. So when I am outside in a lightning storm, I absolutely have to get indoors as quickly as possible. I'm still 2 miles away from my car. Nothing is around me except for woods, which are already attracting the lightning. Trees attract lightning, and they were all around. And then it's me, and I attract lightning. So I'm running. And about half a mile into my run, I just start praying. I'm like, right now this storm is getting way too close to us. There is no way we are going to make it back to the car. I have been having this urge to pray now for months. I am praying now. If any time is the time to pray, it is now. So for that last mile and a half back to my car, I prayed. Over and over again, I prayed, God, please slow down this storm. Let us get back to the car. Please, God, slow down this storm. And as soon as I started praying, that storm seemed to hit a brick wall. It had been growing on us and getting closer to us at a much faster rate than we were getting closer to the car. So basically before, we're going like this and the storm is going like this. So the storm is catching up to us. As soon as I start praying, that storm starts going at the same pace we are. Just pacing us, not getting any closer. We get to be a couple minutes away from the car. The storm seems to start picking up speed again. We get back to my car. I put Timon in the back seat. I get in the front and I close the front driver's side door. And as soon as I do, the heavens open up and the rain just starts pouring down. As soon as I got home, I started looking through all my stuff, trying to find my Bible that was given to me when I graduated high school. I found it, and I started looking through it, and I was a little disappointed because it was written in a more modern language. It didn't have like the old-time English. And so I decided, you know what? I want to actually read this. For the first time in my life, I want to actually see what the Bible is saying. After everything I have experienced recently, I think it may be time. So I went online and I bought a King James version of the Bible. And I didn't get a chance to start reading it right away, but I have begun to read it now. And I'm about halfway through Genesis, and already there are some really crazy things that are changing the way that I look at religion and possibly the origins of modern civilization. So, without further ado, let's begin the first edition of Bible Study with an Atheist. So the first thing that I want to talk about is going to be right on the very first page of Genesis. The very first page of the Bible. Now, the first page of the Bible is basically the creation of the universe. So when we get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God's created heaven and earth, light and dark. He's created animals. And this section is titled Creation of Man and the Image of God. So I'm going to go ahead and read Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And I'm going to wait for a second. I'm going to let you think about, is there anything strange in there? And then I'm going to reread it. So, without further ado, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." All right, let me read that again. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." What? I'm sorry, but us and our are plural. That would mean that God is talking to someone or something else. It is not my image or your image. It's our image. It's not my likeness or your likeness. It's our likeness. It's not let me create or let you create. It's let us create. That word, or those words, us and our, being used in this verse the way that they are, sounds like God is talking to a group of beings that are equal to him, or her, or it, whatever. Now in verse 27, it continues. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Own is italicized. That means that our attention is supposed to be brought to the word own. An emphasis is put on the word own. That adds and helps to emphasize the differentiation between the let us create man in our image, in our likeness. That differentiates the two. So those two verses, for me, almost sound like God has gone up to another group of beings and said, hey, let us create man in our image, in our likeness. Let's give him reign over everything on the earth. Let's make earth theirs. Let's put them in our image. Wouldn't that be cool? But it seems like they said no. And so God is just like, well, I'm going to make man in my own image then. Screw you. That's what that sounds like. Now, I kind of put it out of my mind as I kept reading. But then when I got to page 3, just page 3, it was reiterated. This is God talking about Adam and Eve after they've eaten the apple in the Garden of Eden. Genesis chapter 3, verse 22. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. One of us? Who is he talking to? Because there's no mention of angels around this. The only other being besides Adam and Eve and God is the snake. But despite what modern Christians would tell you, it doesn't really refer to the snake as the devil or Satan. It's just a snake. It's just a snake. So who is God talking to? Who is the us? That really, really intrigues me. Because if that's the case, then that actually lends even more credence, in my opinion, potentially to simulation theory. It's almost like God is creating a simulation and he's going to a panel of scientists and saying, hey, maybe we should make man in our own image and kind of see what happens when we give him control over everything. And when they said no, he was like, screw it, I'm going to make him in my own image anyway. And then once man has eaten the apple, God goes to that panel, and it is like, well, behold, the man has become one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. I mean, he might as well at this point. It sounds like God went behind the back of a panel of other beings similar to him or it and broke what they told him to do. And when man broke rules themselves, God went to the panel of other beings and was like, well, they become one of us. They know good and evil now. They might as well now eat from the tree of life and live forever. I mean, might as well. What? It blows my mind. And that's just page 3. Absolutely blows my mind. And what's crazy is that it's reiterated again in a much more subtle manner, but it is reiterated again. And this is going to be when God is talking to Abram, who becomes Abraham, about a covenant between the two. And this is Genesis chapter 17, verse 7 and 8. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. Verse 8, and I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. There are 2 words in all of that change the entire meaning, and it changes entirely what or who God is. Verse 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. A God. Not God, but to be a God. And to be a God would be lowercase g, not capital G. To be a God means that there are others like you, whether it be other gods or other beings that are like you. You were just lifted up to a higher status. Like we refer to sports athletes as gods. Like Tom Brady is a god. This sounds like God has created a covenant with Abram in order to just be treated like a god. To become a god. Not God, but a God. And to be a God is a lowercase g. Then in verse 8 it says, I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Basically, he's saying, I'll be the God to them. That would mean that there are other gods. This, to me, falls in line with how every other religion really has always been on this planet. There has always been usually multiple gods. Through almost every religion, there is usually not a singular God. There may be a most powerful God, but there are always many. This reiterates that. It also reiterates the usage of the word us and the usage of the word our. For me, that's mind-blowing. That opens up the possibilities to so much. Now, the second thing I want to touch on is a little bit lighter. I think it's kind of a little bit funny, actually, in a way. And it actually picks up right after verse 8. So it's right after God says, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Verse 9, and God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. Why did he go directly to the foreskin in circumcision? Why? It's never mentioned before that. It's literally its own sentence. It doesn't even flow with what's before it. It's like it was thrown in later. Why does God go directly to circumcision? It is never mentioned before, and so far I have only seen it in the rest of chapter 17. After chapter 17 ends, it is never mentioned, as far as I know of, again. Why did this, or why was this the first thing that God said, you know what, we're going to have a covenant, and if you want to keep this covenant, you have to chop off your foreskin. What? Why, man? Why? I don't get it. I don't get it. And that really struck me. Like, I had to stop reading because it was so out of nowhere that I was confused. I was like, did I miss something? Did they talk about this beforehand that may give some insinuation that they're going to be bringing this up? Like, it's just out of the blue. And so I literally stopped reading when I saw that, and I had to laugh. I was just like, why? Why? So, yeah. That's all for the second point. Now, for this third point, it's also going to kind of go in a similar thought process as the first point. And it brings us right back to the first page of Genesis. So right after God has created man in his own image, we then have Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. What? What? All right, so let me read this again. And remember the circumstances here. God has just created the first man. The first man. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. What? My understanding is that if you replenish something, that something had to have been there in the first place. So for example, say that you're a farmer and you sell fruit at a local farmer's market. You go and you're setting everything up and you pick up a bushel of apples, the first bushel of apples of the day, and you put it on the table. You are not replenishing apples. You are supplying apples. Now say somebody comes by, they buy that bushel of apples, and so you reach down and you pick up a second bushel of apples that were underneath your table. You then put that second bushel onto the table. You have then replenished the apples because they were there once before and then were gone. And so you put more in their place to replenish them. So if God is talking to his original creation, why is he telling them to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth? It doesn't make sense if this is the first iteration. Now, it could just be a little bit of confusion, it could be the wrong word being used or something like that, there could be a mistake. So I kept reading. And then we get to the story of Noah. And pretty much everybody knows the story of Noah and his ark. Well, at this point, the floodwaters have subsided. Pretty much man has been wiped out. And God comes up to Noah. And in chapter 9, verse 1, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And it makes sense there because God has essentially wiped out all mankind. So essentially, they are having to replenish the earth because man is no longer there. Like man does not hold dominion over the earth at that point. So if that's the case, they use the exact same wordage there as they do at the beginning of Genesis. Then to me, that tells me that word or those words were used for a reason. Those words, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, were chosen for a reason. That would mean that the civilization that we know, that is descendant from this story of Genesis, is not the first iteration. What? And what's crazy about that is that actually kind of lends a little bit of credibility to some potentially so-called pseudoscience where people think that some civilizations may have actually existed up to like 15, 20,000 years ago. There are a number of different scholars and so-called pseudoscientists that believe there is a lot of evidence and data that indicates some civilizations were around well before what we think is the beginning. Göbekli Tepe is a great example. The Sphinx in Egypt, both of those indicate that their civilizations existed well before where we put the beginning of modern civilization, I think, which is beginning with ancient Sumeria. This adds credence to that, especially when you take into consideration the science of the fact we've had many different mass extinction events on this planet. I find that really interesting. Now, I want to also just kind of touch base on something that is a little bit more down to earth that bothered me about this. So the three main modern world religions today, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are all Abrahamic religions. So they all can trace their roots back to Abraham, Sarah, and his family. You would think that people who serve as the foundation for three major modern religions would be good people. They're not at all. And it bothers me. It really, really bothers me. How is it that we are basing a religion around people who are as bad as Abraham and Sarah? How? And let me explain, because I already know that there's going to be people out there who are probably going to be a little offended by that. But the story of Hagar and the story of Lot and the angels in Sodom and Gomorrah, I think, are the two best stories to explain why I think this. So let me start off just with the general explanation of the story of Lot and the two angels that come to visit him in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot, if I remember correctly, is related to Abraham. I think he's like a brother or something like that. But Lot lives in, I think it's Sodom. And Abraham has pleaded and worked out a deal with God to where if there are just 10 virtuous men in Sodom and Gomorrah, God will spare those cities from complete and utter destruction. So God sends down a couple of angels to go and visit Lot and visit the city. Well, the angels come to visit Lot, and then a mob of people come, and they're like, bring out your visitors so that we may know them. And so basically it's saying, bring out your visitors so we can rape them. That's basically what they're saying. And this part's good. Lot goes out and he says, no, you can't. I'm not subjecting my visitors to that, which is good. But then he says, I do, however, have 2 young daughters who have not known man that you can do with as you please. So here you go. That's not a good freaking person. That's not virtuous. But it was seen as virtuous in the eyes of God and the angels. These 2 young girls, complete virgins, are given to a mob of people to rape. That's not virtuous. I'm sorry, if somebody comes to visit my house, I've known you for 30 minutes, and a mob comes and says, give us your visitors or give us your children, I'm sorry. Bye-bye, visitors. I'm not giving children to a mob so that they can do awful things to them. But that's what Lot does. And that's seen as virtuous in the eyes of God and angels. That's not virtuous. Now, Abraham and Sarah, looking at the story of Hagar. So, Abraham and Sarah, they want children. They've been praying for decades to God to give them children. But as they are approaching 100 years old, they're beginning to realize that, you know what, we're probably never going to have kids. So what does Sarah do? She takes one of her servants, as the Bible calls her. She's actually a slave, though. So she takes her slave and forces her slave to have sex with Abraham so that Abraham can have an heir. Well, they do have sex, and she does get pregnant. The slave gets pregnant with Abraham's child. Only then does God deem them worthy enough to have children. So only once Sarah has given her slave to Abraham to have a child with, does God then say, you know what, I'm going to give you a child. Now, with their own child, Sarah grows jealous. And so Sarah doesn't like the idea now that her slave has a child with her husband. Even though that slave had no choice whatsoever in the matter, Sarah basically tells Abraham to kick Hagar and the child out. And I'm going to read this portion to you because Abraham and Sarah are the foundation. And this, to me, goes to the heart of, I think, a lot of what's wrong with religion is it is based on not good people. Genesis chapter 21, verse 9 through 13. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of thy lad, because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. Basically, Sarah's a jealous woman, demands that Abraham kick her slave and that slave's son, Abraham's son also, out onto the streets, despite the fact that that slave would never have had sex with Abraham otherwise, would never have had that child otherwise. So if Sarah had never come to them and forced them into it, they wouldn't have been in that circumstance anyway. But because Sarah was an awful woman and then became jealous, they now have to go out onto the streets. Abraham, to his credit, did think it was not so good. He wasn't happy about it. But then God of all things says, don't worry about it. It's okay. Don't worry about that woman and her son, your son. Don't worry. Your child will be named Isaac. Isn't that great? It's Isaac. Oh, and that other kid. Again, don't worry about him. I'm going to give him some land. So it's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. What? That is an awful circumstance that was created by the people who are the foundation for modern religion. Those are not good people. And honestly, that bothers me more than anything else I have read so far in the first 16 and a half pages of this book. They serve as the foundation for everything, for our three major world religions. They should be virtuous and they should be good, and they are anything but. That bothers me. Now, the final point that I want to talk about is absolutely the craziest. And considering what I've already talked about so far today, that says something. But it ties in a lot of what's been said, especially with the us, our, replenish, a God, I will be their God. It ties in to that. And it surrounds a few different things that have always bothered me, even since I was a little kid and believed in God like I believed in Santa. Those things that really bothered me were the extended lifespans early on in the Bible, and then the fact that there were cities filled with thousands and thousands of people within just a generation or two of Adam and Eve. How does that happen? How does that happen? So this is more of a theory that I am kind of contemplating based on what I have read so far and based on the fact that I do kind of lean a little bit towards simulation theory. So, God, he creates the heaven and the earth, right? Creates light and dark, creates all the animals on the earth. Now, what if most of man is actually part of that animal creation? That is the Homo sapiens before essentially discovering fire, before discovering the wheel, things like that. That's basically Homo sapiens before we adapted into a slightly more sophisticated species. Then God creates Adam and Eve in his own image, right? Adam and Eve and their direct descendants, which are, that's the lineage that we're following in the Bible, is the descendants of Adam and Eve. That explains why they are the ones that live starting out for nearly 1,000 years. That explains that. And then as time goes on, those ancestors, or those descendants of Adam and Eve the beings created in the likeness of God, as those descendants begin to wed and mate with more of the basic Homo sapien species, their ages decline. They decrease. So at generation after generation, after there are marriages between Adam and Eve's descendants and the basic man, those ages, they decrease. Absolutely, they decrease to where Adam and Eve and like Noah, they lived for nearly 1,000 years, but Abraham and Sarah, they lived for 150 years, 160 years, something like that. It's because as time goes on, the beast man is kind of intermingling with the created in his image species. It helps to kind of explain, potentially, why it is replenish the earth. Because maybe they're not replenishing the earth of man, but they're replenishing earth of man that is like God. So is it possible that God and those other beings come from earth beforehand, and so God then creates a little bit of man in his own image to potentially replenish the earth of their species? In a way, that's kind of how this sounds. As ridiculous as that sounds to me, even as I'm speaking it out loud now, that's almost how this reads to me. It is almost like there are two separate species of man that over the course of Genesis are blending more and more into one, while we still continue to follow the lineage of Adam and Eve. Again, that's probably stretching it a little bit, but there are so many things in just the first 21 and a half chapters of Genesis that are causing me to question a lot of different stuff. And so I am really intrigued and excited to continue to read more on this and to see what else I'm going to come across that's going to completely change my perceptions on things. I think a lot of what I've read so far gives a lot of credence potentially to simulation theory. I think that it also gives potential credence to, as ridiculous as this is, ancient astronauts theory. It really does. It really does give some credence to that. All in all, I'm excited to continue to read more on this. And so that's where I'm going to leave it at today, everybody. I hope that you did enjoy it. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button with the little bell, because I will be posting up every single Sunday, giving you my thoughts on what I have read over the past week. And I would really love to get the insight of both religious people and atheists down below, just to kind of get your perspective on some of the things that I have talked about today. And until next time, everybody, I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to our next Bible study. Bye-bye.